The sun scorched the dry Texas soil, the kind of heat that made the horizon shimmer and your breath feel heavy. The breeze carried dust, silence, and something else, something no one saw coming. On the edge of a forgotten road, 3 puppies sat tied to a dying tree. Their ribs showed through their fur. Their cries were too weak to carry far. They were barely 6 weeks old, too young to fight, too young to understand why they'd been left there. The rope cut into their necks, holding them prisoner under the sky. People passed. Some slowed their cars, shook their heads, and drove on. Others didn't even glance their way. No food. No water. No chance. Until a man came walking down the road. Not just any man. A soldier. One who had just returned from war, carrying more than just bags. He carried the weight of things no one else could see. His name was Tom Walker. 35 years old. An Army staff sergeant who had served 2 tours overseas. He wasn't looking to be a hero that day. He was just trying to breathe again. Trying to find silence that didn't scream. But what he found instead were 3 lives on the edge of dying, and a moment that would change everything. This is not just a story about rescue. It's a story about purpose rediscovered. About broken things becoming whole. About the unspoken bond between a man who had seen too much, and 3 puppies who hadn't seen enough. And maybe, just maybe, it's a story about how love doesn't always walk through the front door. Sometimes, it crawls out from under a tree, and asks you to choose. Because in that moment, Tom Walker didn't just save them. They saved him, too. Hope, Texas wasn't the kind of town that made headlines. Tucked between stretches of cattle fields and sun-bleached dirt roads, it was a place where time moved slower, where folks still waved from porches and the corner store closed at sundown. The summers were long, the air thick with the smell of dry grass and engine oil, and the kind of silence that hung heavy after the sun dipped behind the hills. Tom Walker hadn't planned on coming back. After 8 years in uniform and 2 deployments overseas, hope felt more like a memory than a home. But when his father passed away, leaving behind the old ranch on the south side of town, Tom had no choice but to return. He hadn't set foot on the property in years. Not since the funeral for his mother, not since the war changed the boy who had once played catch in that dusty backyard. Now, the house stood quiet. Windows clouded with time, screen door hanging on one rusted hinge, and weeds claiming what used to be a garden. Inside, it smelled like old wood, forgotten coffee, and something more subtle, grief left too long in the air. Tom parked his truck beneath the same oak tree he'd climbed as a kid. The soil crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the porch. His duffel bag, faded, frayed, and heavy with more than gear, slapped against his leg with each step. He didn't know what he was looking for. Peace? Forgiveness? A way to start over? All he knew was that the uniform no longer fit the life ahead, and the silence of this place didn't soothe him the way it used to. It pressed in, reminded him of things he'd tried hard to forget, sounds that never left, faces that never returned. He hadn't spoken to anyone in town since arriving. Just a nod at the gas station clerk, a brief exchange at the feed store. People remembered him. But Tom wasn't sure he remembered himself. The land was dry. The sky was quiet. And somewhere, not far from that dusty road, a cry was about to break through the silence. One that would pull him into something he didn't expect. Something that would bring him back to life. The sun hung high over the outskirts of hope, unrelenting and cruel. It was the kind of heat that made the ground crack and the air shimmer, a heat that stole your breath before you could even speak. Out near the edge of an overgrown lot, just beyond a rusted chain-link fence, stood a mesquite tree, bare, brittle, and tired. Beneath it, 3 puppies sat tied with a fraying length of rope. They didn't bark. Not anymore. Their cries had dried up with their strength, leaving only shallow breaths and hollow eyes. German Shepherd pups, no more than 6 weeks old. Their legs too wobbly to stand for long, their bellies sunken with hunger. One had a white crescent patch on her chest. Another, sandy brown, lay on his side, twitching weakly in the dirt. The third, black with sharp eyes, kept trying to rise, only to collapse again. A few feet away, old tire tracks marked the path of a pickup truck that had come and gone. No note. No explanation. Just a silent decision to abandon life and drive away. From across the road, behind a faded curtain, an elderly woman watched. She'd seen the truck pull up hours ago. The man stepped out without urgency, like he was dropping off groceries instead of leaving behind living creatures. He tied the rope to the tree, wiped sweat from his brow, then got back in and drove off without a backward glance. She had called animal control twice. No one answered. And deep down, she knew no one would. Not for dogs. Not in this town. Now the sun bore down, the air buzzed with flies, and the only sounds were shallow, trembling breaths. No food. No water. No chance. At least, that's what it looked like. Until someone finally came walking. The black pup let out a sound, not quite a bark, not quite a cry. It was hoarse, broken, like a whisper torn from lungs too dry to speak. The others stirred slightly, one raising its head for a moment before letting it fall again. They were past panic now. Past fear. What remained was confusion, hunger, and the slow, creeping weight of giving up. The rope around their necks was worn, but it held firm. Just tight enough to keep them close to the tree. Just loose enough to let them move in circles, chasing shadows in the dirt. Their paws were raw from scraping at the ground. Their tongues hung dry from their mouths. Even their whimpers were tired now. They didn't understand what had happened. 1 minute, they had a mother. Warmth. Milk. Safety. Then she was gone. And the man with the sharp smell and loud voice, the one who shoved them into the back of the truck, wasn't her. He didn't speak to them. He didn't pet them. He just tied the rope, turned his back, and drove away into the dust. Cars had passed. A few had slowed. A couple of windows had rolled down. But no one stopped. Some people saw dogs. Others saw a mess someone else would deal with. And the puppies, too young to know better, waited. Waited for their mother. For a kind voice. For something. From the front porch across the street, the old woman clutched a glass of sweet tea that had gone warm. She watched the pups slump against one another, too tired to move. She whispered a quiet prayer, but her voice didn't carry. Neither did their yelps. The town of hope didn't hear them. Or maybe it did, and chose to stay silent. But something else was coming. Something that would change everything. Tom Walker's boots stirred up the dust as he walked the old trail behind his father's ranch, the sun dipping low enough to cast long shadows across the parched Texas earth. He hadn't meant to walk far, just enough to get out of the house, to quiet the restless pressure building in his chest. But the silence didn't help. Not anymore. He'd once loved this trail. As a boy, he used to race his dog Samson down it, leaping over stones, chasing after rabbits he never caught. Back then, the land felt alive, like it had a heartbeat. Now, it just felt empty. Tom was 35, but the war made him feel older. The medals in the box on the dresser back home didn't mean much to him. They didn't stop the dreams. They didn't stop the nights he'd jolt awake, sweat cold on his neck, ears straining for the sound of gunfire that never came. He'd only been back in hope for 12 days. Long enough to sign some papers, clean out the closets, and realize just how quiet life had become. The house was still full of his father's things, tools lined up in the garage, a dented coffee mug on the windowsill, a stack of unopened mail on the counter. His dad had been a tough man. Not cruel, but distant. The kind of man who said good job with a nod, not a hug. Tom hadn't cried when he died. He hadn't cried in years. He missed his mom more. She'd passed when he was 21, just before he shipped off. The ranch hadn't felt like home since she left. Tom stopped at the edge of a dry field, the wind tugging at his shirt. He closed his eyes and breathed deep. Dirt. Sunlight. Memories. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like waiting. The kind of waiting that soldiers know too well, when something is coming, but you don't know what. You just feel it in your bones. And in that silence, somewhere beyond the fence line, came a sound that didn't belong. A faint, sharp yelp. Then another. He opened his eyes, heart already moving before his feet did. Something needed him. And for the first time in a long while, he was ready to answer. Tom moved quickly, instincts kicking in before thought. The yelp had come from the old lot past the fence, a patch of overgrown brush and rusting debris where no one had built anything in years. He ducked under a sagging wire strand and pushed through the dry weeds, each step stirring up swirls of dust. Then he saw them. 3 small bodies huddled beneath a brittle mesquite tree, their forms barely more than shadows against the dirt. His breath caught. Puppies. German shepherds. Tied together at the neck by a rope so thin it looked like it would snap, but hadn't. He dropped to his knees, dust puffing up around him. The stench hit first, sweat, urine, and something worse. The brown one lay limp, eyes glazed, chest rising and falling like a whisper. The smallest one with the white patch flinched at his shadow, her tiny legs trembling. The black one, the largest, lifted his head and let out a weak growl. It wasn't threatening. It was scared. Tom swallowed hard. His hands trembled. "Easy," he said softly, barely louder than a breath. "I'm not gonna hurt you." He pulled a small knife from his pocket and carefully reached for the rope. The pups didn't resist. One by one, he freed them. Their bodies sagged into his arms, light as air, too quiet. He unscrewed the cap on his canteen and poured a bit into his palm, holding it under their noses. One drank, then another. They licked at the water like they hadn't seen a drop in days. Anger welled in Tom's chest, hot, choking, blinding. But deeper than that, something else stirred. A familiar ache. A responsibility. A memory of what it meant to protect something small, something innocent. He looked at them and whispered, "You're coming with me." And they did. The garage was still the way his father had left it, tools neatly hung on pegboards, whale stains marking the concrete floor like old battle scars. The smell of motor grease, sawdust, and time clung to the air. Tom pushed open the creaking side door, the heat outside pressing against his back like a weight. He stepped in carefully, cradling the 3 puppies against his chest, their bodies limp, their breathing shallow. His duffel bag was still in the corner, unopened. The only space clear of dust was the workbench, where his father used to rebuild carburetors in silence. Tom moved to the far side of the room, where 2 rolled-up sleeping bags lay tucked beside a storage shelf. He hadn't planned on using them. Now they were a makeshift bed. He knelt down and laid the puppies gently onto the fabric. They barely stirred. The brown one, whom he'd started calling Rusty in his mind, whimpered once, a broken sound that cut deeper than any combat memory. The small one with the white patch, Luna, curled into herself, flinching every time Tom shifted his hand. The black one sat upright, weak but watching him with sharp eyes. Tom opened a can of wet dog food he'd picked up at the gas station on his way back. The smell was strong, but the pups didn't react. "Come on," he whispered, dipping 2 fingers into the food. He reached toward Luna first, holding the paste near her mouth. She turned away, then, hesitantly, licked it. A moment passed, then she took another. Then another. Rusty followed suit, nudging forward with slow, hungry movements. But it was the black pup, silent, alert, who stared at Tom the whole time. He didn't blink. Didn't break eye contact. Even as he ate, his eyes never left Tom's face. Tom sat back, arms resting on his knees, staring at the 3 tiny bodies stretched across the sleeping bags. He hadn't meant to take them in. He didn't know what he was doing. But something in this space, this old garage filled with the ghosts of his past, suddenly felt less empty. Something was breathing again. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He stayed in the garage with them, back against the wall, the faint hum of cicadas buzzing through the cracked windows. The air was warm, still, and filled with the kind of quiet that should have been peaceful, but wasn't. Luna began to cry. It was a thin, high-pitched whimper, almost too soft to hear, but it cut through Tom like a siren. He jolted upright, his pulse spiking like it used to on night patrols. She was shivering, curled into herself, her small body twitching in fear even as her eyes remained closed. Tom reached for her without thinking. He lifted her gently, wrapped her in the edge of his hoodie, and held her against his chest. Her trembling slowed. Her breath steadied. The whimper faded into the quiet thump of his heart. "You're okay," he whispered, unsure if he was talking to her or himself. "You're safe now." Luna sighed, barely audible, and went still. Tom didn't move for hours. His back ached, his neck stiff, but he stayed like that, holding her, listening to the rhythm of tiny breaths rising and falling against him. At some point, Rusty shifted closer, resting a paw on Tom's boot. The black one, still unnamed, sat in the corner, eyes open, alert. When the sun began to rise, casting pale light through the grime-streaked window, Tom blinked slowly. Luna was still in his arms, asleep. The other 2 were nestled close together, a tangle of fur and quiet trust. He should have called a rescue group. Should have found someone who knew what they were doing. But he didn't want to. Something in him, something cracked and quiet, was starting to stir. Later that morning, he laid them on an old blanket in the living room. As they napped, he watched the black pup inch closer to his boot, then sit at attention, tail thumping once. "Axel," he said aloud, testing the name. "Yeah. You look like an Axel." The pup didn't react, but didn't look away either. Tom nodded slowly. He hadn't smiled in months. But something, deep and almost forgotten, tugged at the corners of his mouth. Maybe this wasn't just about rescuing them. Maybe they were rescuing him, too. The house had been silent for too long. Now, it was alive. Luna, Rusty, and Axel moved clumsily through the living room, their tiny paws slipping on the worn hardwood floor. Luna trailed behind the others, her white chest patch gleaming like a tiny crescent moon as she sniffed cautiously at table legs. Rusty, always a beat ahead, charged straight into an overturned laundry basket and yelped when it flipped over, trapping him briefly beneath a pile of old socks. Tom laughed, really laughed, for the first time since returning home. The sound startled even him. He watched from the couch, sipping black coffee that had gone cold. His hands were still calloused, still tight from years of holding weapons instead of moments like this. And yet, here he was, watching 3 abandoned puppies trip and tumble through his father's house like they'd always belonged there. Axel sat near the fireplace, staring at his reflection in the glass. His ears twitched with every sound, every shift. When Tom called his name, Axel turned immediately, walked over, and sat by his leg like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're different," Tom muttered, reaching down to stroke his head. "You've got something in you." Axel's gaze never left his. Tom remembered that look. He'd seen it before, in the field, in men who waited for orders but didn't need them to act. Focus. Loyalty. Instinct. Rusty barked once and rolled onto his back, tongue lolling. Luna pawed at the edge of the rug before curling into a tight little ball. Tom leaned back, the corners of his mouth still holding that rare smile. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt full. Maybe not of answers, but of hope. And hope, Tom thought, was a good place to start. That night, after the puppies had fallen asleep in a heap of warm fur and quiet breaths, Tom sat alone at the old kitchen table, flipping through a dusty file he'd found in one of his father's locked drawers. The folder smelled like aged paper and motor oil, filled with documents he didn't remember seeing before, contracts, letters, receipts. Most of it seemed like clutter. Until he saw a name that made his breath catch. Maximus. It was printed beneath a black and white photo of a German shepherd. The dog looked exactly like Axel, same alert eyes, same powerful build, same steady gaze. But what caught Tom's attention wasn't the resemblance. It was the caption below. Sire, Maximus, Kia, Syria, 2018. Medal of Valor. Tom flipped the page. A breeding chart. Certifications. Official stamps from something called K9 Elite Tactical Program, San Antonio Division. Then, at the bottom, scribbled in ink. Batch 0099A, rejected litter, deemed unstable, destroy by end of week. Tom stared at the words, jaw clenched, a cold pit forming in his stomach. Rejected. Destroy. He looked up, toward the living room, where the three puppies slept, Luna curled under a blanket, Rusty sprawled on his back, and Axel, ever watchful, now finally asleep but facing the door. They weren't supposed to be here. Someone had tried to erase them. Tom's hand tightened around the file. Not anymore, he thought. Not on his watch. It was a quiet morning when the black sedan showed up. Tom had been out in the backyard, hammering together a sturdier fence for the puppies. He looked up when he heard the low rumble of tires on gravel. The car moved slow, deliberate, like it didn't want to raise suspicion, but wasn't hiding, either. It stopped just outside the property line. Tom wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward, instinct kicking in. The windows were tinted, the kind of dark that didn't just block sunlight, it blocked intent. Then the driver's side window rolled down with a soft whir. The man inside looked to be in his early 60s. Sharp eyes. Tan hat. Calm expression. He didn't get out. "You Tom Walker?" he asked, voice flat, professional. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Carver," the man replied. "I'm here about the dogs." Tom didn't answer. Carver tilted his head, eyes drifting toward the porch, where Axel had just come into view. The pup stood tall, watching with an intensity far beyond his age. "Nice posture," Carver muttered. "That one's got drive." "They're not for sale," Tom said. "I'm not here to buy," Carver replied. "4 days ago, I was scheduled to pick up 3 German Shepherd pups from a breeder named Wendell Burke. Got there, and they were gone. Burke said they'd gone to a better home." Tom didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. "What Burke didn't mention," Carver continued, "is that these pups were part of a classified litter. Bred for tactical K9 service. Paid for. documented, evaluated, and ultimately rejected. Rejected, Tom echoed, slowly. Temperament concerns, Carver said. Program didn't want the liability. Burke was ordered to cull them. Guess he didn't follow through. Tom crossed his arms. So instead he tied them to a tree and left them to die. Carver didn't blink. Sometimes people don't follow orders cleanly. Well, neither do I, Tom said. They're not going anywhere. Carver gave a faint smile. I figured you'd say that. Without another word, he rolled up the window and drove off, the car kicking up dust as it disappeared down the road. That night, Tom didn't sleep. He sat near the front window, shotgun resting beside the door. Axel lay nearby, ears perked, body still, eyes locked on the shadows. Tom pulled the file from the drawer again. He traced Maximus' name with his finger. Axel stirred slightly, then looked at him. These pups weren't just abandoned. They were targets. And now, someone knew exactly where they were. Tom clenched his jaw. If they wanted a fight, they'd find one waiting. The next afternoon was hot and still, the kind of heat that made the air hang heavy and time slow down. Tom was out back with the pups, watching Axel weave effortlessly through the makeshift course he'd built. Rusty barked at a fluttering leaf, Luna chewed on a worn tennis ball, but Axel was all business, focused, sharp, alert. Then Luna froze. She let out a series of short, high-pitched barks, not playful, not curious, warning. Tom's head snapped up. He followed her gaze toward the long dirt road that led to the property. A black SUV was coming. Not fast. Not slow. Just deliberate. Tom didn't hesitate. He called the dogs inside and grabbed the shotgun. His boots echoed across the wooden floor as he moved to the front door. Axel stayed glued to his side, muscles taut, eyes tracking every motion outside. The SUV rolled to a stop 20 yards from the porch. The engine idled. Then the driver's door opened. This time, it wasn't Carver. A younger man stepped out, lean build, clean suit, dark sunglasses that reflected everything and revealed nothing. He didn't smile. Didn't introduce himself. He simply stood beside the vehicle, hands in his pockets. "Can I help you?" Tom called out. The man tilted his head. "Mr. Walker, I believe you have something that doesn't belong to you. You've got the wrong house." "I don't think so. You're in possession of 3 genetically classified German Shepherds, property of the K9 Elite Tactical Program." Tom's voice turned cold. "You mean the puppies someone tied to a tree and left to die?" "They were scheduled for removal," the man said, unfazed. "It was a decision made by our director. You weren't supposed to interfere. You tried to kill them," Tom snapped. "We were correcting a mistake." Behind him, Axel let out a deep, low growl. The man gave a slight nod toward the SUV. The back door opened. Another man stepped out, carrying a sleek black case, the kind used for tranquilizer guns, not bullets. Tom raised the shotgun a single inch. "I'm only going to say this once," he said. "Get off my land." The suited man didn't move. But Axel did. He stepped forward, stance wide, growl rising from his chest like thunder. The message was clear. These dogs weren't going anywhere. And neither was Tom. The air between them tightened, heavy with tension. Dust swirled lazily around the tires of the black SUV, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. The man in the suit took one slow step forward, raising his hands, not in surrender, but in subtle assertion. You were a soldier, Walker, he said, his voice calm but pointed. You know how this works. Orders are orders. You think you're protecting them, but you're only delaying the inevitable. Tom's grip on the shotgun didn't waver. No, he replied. I'm stopping it. The second man, the one holding the case, began moving toward the house. Not fast, not aggressive, but with intent. That's when Axel moved. A blur of black fur and muscle, he shot forward with precision that could only be described as trained. He planted himself directly in the man's path, barking with a force that startled even Tom. It wasn't the bark of a puppy, it was the command of a protector. The man froze mid-step. Rusty and Luna followed, smaller but no less determined, forming a ragged semicircle in front of Tom. They didn't growl out of fear. They growled with purpose. The man with the case backed up, slowly, eyes darting between the dogs and Tom's unwavering stance. The suited man looked at Axel, disbelief flickering across his face. He's already bonding, he muttered. Unbelievable. Without another word, he turned, opened the SUV door, and stepped inside. The vehicle reversed smoothly, kicking up a veil of dust as it vanished down the road. Tom didn't move until the sound of the engine faded completely. He lowered the shotgun and exhaled, knees slightly shaking, not from fear, but from something deeper. Something more final. He dropped to one knee beside Axel, placed both hands on the pup's face, and looked into his eyes. You chose to protect them, he whispered, voice thick. Just like me. Axel licked his chin once, then sat down calmly at Tom's side, as if nothing had happened. That night, Tom locked every door and window. He moved the pup's crate into his room, loaded the shotgun, and placed it beside the bed. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Because this wasn't just about saving puppies anymore. It was about standing up against something broken. And for the first time since the war, Tom Walker had something worth fighting for. Something worth protecting. And someone willing to fight beside him. Weeks passed. The black SUV never returned, but Tom knew the silence was temporary. So he gathered everything, photographs of the pup's condition, the documents he'd found in his father's drawer, the breeding charts, the name batch 0099A scrawled in ink. He drove it all straight to Sheriff Davis. The sheriff, grizzled and slow-moving but sharp as ever at 65, listened in silence as Tom laid it out. When Tom finished, Davis let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. Burke's name has come up before, he muttered. Never had proof. Always knew something smelled off about that program. The investigation started small, but grew fast. The K9 Elite Tactical Program had buried more than one failed litter. Temperament reports altered. Death orders disguised as euthanasia due to illness. Wendell Burke, the breeder, was arrested within days. Charges: cruelty, falsified records, illegal breeding practices. The truth came out. And with it, so did justice. As the program unraveled, the question arose, what would happen to the pups? The answer was simple. They'd already found where they belonged. Rusty, always clumsy and joyful, was paired with an 8-year-old boy on the autism spectrum. They were inseparable within days. Luna went home with a retired military widow. She's the first one to make me laugh in 3 years, the woman said, clutching her like a lifeline. And Axel? Axel stayed with Tom. They trained together every morning. Visited veterans' homes, schools, and shelters. They didn't wear uniforms, but they served a mission just the same, reminding people that strength isn't always loud, and sometimes the most broken souls are the ones who heal others. When Tom looked at Axel now, he didn't see a puppy rescued from the brink. He saw a partner. He saw redemption. And he knew, without ever needing to say it, that the life he'd thought was over was just beginning again. This story reminds us that healing often begins in the most unexpected places. Sometimes, it's not through grand gestures or perfect plans, but through quiet moments of compassion, through choosing to protect what others overlook. Tom didn't just rescue 3 abandoned puppies, they rescued him, too. They taught him, and all of us, that love, loyalty, and second chances can rebuild what war, grief, or time have broken. No life is ever truly lost when someone cares enough to fight for it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss more powerful stories like this one. We believe in sharing stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the goodness still left in the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, even the smallest act of kindness can change a life. Maybe even yours.